Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Guilt-Free Book Club. Once again, we are back with this fabulous book, Learning That Matters, a field guide to course design for transformative education. Today, we're going to talk about project-based learning based on Chapter 7, The Power of Projects. Really delighted to welcome some special guests from Wentworth faculty to talk about how they use project-based learning in their courses. But first, I'm just going to introduce oh, and we have another guest coming in. I'm going to introduce our collaborative notes document for those who are watching this on a video. The folks in this Zoom right now are going to have the opportunity to go into this document. It's a shared document. And first, we're going to share our opening question, go around style. And then if you want to, if you have some favorite quotes from the chapter that you have discovered, you're welcome to put those favorite quotes in. Or if you haven't gotten a chance to read, you're welcome to just peruse those favorite quotes just as like kind of a cliff notes to the chapter. And then another thing is the key takeaways. So if you have any takeaways from this discussion, feel free to just add them in as you are listening to the discussion. You're in the Zoom room, just so that we have kind of a shared document of our thinking made visible, a record of what we talked about. And if you have any other resources related to the topic that come up in conversation, definitely put them in here. I've obviously populated this with a bunch of stuff already, but and if you're watching this on video and want access to this document, just email us at teach@wit.edu. So let's do our go around question, and I'll put that back in the chat for Marie Claire, who just joined us. Welcome, Marie Claire. Thanks so much for being here. We're just going to introduce ourselves. Really quickly, tell us, what you do at whatever university you work at, in the colleges of the Fenway, and tell us about a project that, impacted you, whether you facilitated it or whether you did it as a student. I'll start. My name is Josh Luckins, instructional designer here at the Teaching and Learning Collaborative. And when I was thinking about project-based learning and this question, one that came up was just when I was in graduate school, we did a lot of work on devising original theater. And one professor would bring in a lot of interesting creative constraints with particular prompts from a body of work called Viewpoints. And we would get to make work with these very specific creative constraints, and it brought out fascinating things. Like there was a lot more abstraction, or there was a lot more poetry, or there was a lot more this, that, or the other. And it was so cool because we made the types of things that we never would have made otherwise without the creative constraints, but it was still on the group to have that agency, that creativity, that joy of play, creation, discovery, and then obviously the feedback loop of showing it and getting feedback from our peers, and then revising it, and doing all of that learning. And then when I was teaching, I got to use that similar technique, and obviously just having students create something, whether it's a quick 5-minute sketch or a longer term project, is a great example of project-based learning, in that it gives students the a direct application of what it is we're doing, gives them the opportunity to do that immediately and get feedback both from the process, from each other, and from the folks who are viewing the work. So that's me. I'll turn it over to Cindy.
And I have samples if I can share my screen in a few minutes. That's
Well, yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
So I'm Cindy Stevens. I've been at Wentworth for 24 and a half years, professor of management. And I love teaching project-based classes. It really helps the students learn, keeps them from being bored, and it certainly keeps me from being bored because the projects are different all the time. And when you're excited about what you're teaching, it rubs off on your students. So I brought two samples. I'll share my screen. I used to teach a class. I've been teaching a class called Technology Acquisition, which is more technical, and it's also actually a project-based class. So over the years, I kept thinking, how can I make this project-based class more project-based? Because that's what it needs to be, not just teaching about project management. So this first project, let me get this little bar out of the way. What I do is I have like 1,000 contacts on LinkedIn. So I go out on LinkedIn and I try to find project sponsors for projects. So I hook up with companies that maybe need some technology adopted or some recommendations for acquiring technology. And the students have to work with an outside sponsor, with me facilitating the class, and go through all the elements of what a project would look like, with a project charter, a schedule, risk matrix, and I'll just scroll through a little bit of this just so you can see what it looks like. What's nice is it not only lends itself to be a project-based class, actually working on a project, but they do work with an outside sponsor, a professional sponsor, so they're actually being rated and assessed on professionalism and communication and writing along with the aspects of the project. So this particular example, I won't go through the whole document because it's probably about 30 pages long. This group worked with Tori Sabatino with Great Land Partners, and she needed some technology to be researched and determine if her company wants to adopt it. So this is a semester-long project here, which is pretty great. So I'll stop scrolling. I want to get you dizzy. And then another example, which is opposite, and I know Susanna here is going to really like this because it's very related to humanities side of things, but from a business management perspective, I also teach a class called Research Methods. Now, I was not about to go up in front of the class and lecture on research methods all day long. Wow, that's just a lot. So I found a way to do a little lecturing on research methods and what that means and the processes and how to understand all the rules and regulations, APA standards, everything. But I wanted them to work on in teams something that they could actually relate to. So this is a particular project that a group of students worked on. And I went straight to their thesis sentences just so you can look at their thesis for guiding them on this project. Not going to say it's perfect, so don't grade me on it either. But they looked at if they increase their Success Studio time, will it help improve their grades? So they have to put together an entire package with an executive summary. They have to look at definitions related to this research study and go through everything just like you would conduct an official research project that you are going to publish in an academic journal with a literature review related to, what does it mean to get tutoring, how to go to a Success Studio to help you improve your grades. And they go through all this. They have to do a questionnaire of their peers, put together a really good questionnaire, and then they have to study the data. So excuse my scrolling, but then they come up and analyze the data, look at what the graphics are saying, and they determine at the end if whether they've proven their thesis correct or not. So instead of just researching about, lecturing about research methods, they actually can come up with a project, use their own ideas to try to come up with something that feels really good to them, that they're not just coming up with something abstract that they could get excited about. So it's a relevant project, and there's no way that you can plagiarize something like this because it's an original project, which is great. So I wanted to show you those two samples, and I hope that was clear.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that. And I love the point you brought in at the end about, in an age of artificial intelligence, how can we make projects that are really authentic assessments that, relate to what they'd be really doing in the real world, and also combine so many different complex tasks that it really would not be there. It would be worthwhile to kind of try and cheat. The learning happens by doing it inherently within the structure of it. I'm curious, since I know you teach management here at Wentworth, and a classic management teaching strategies, case methods. Have you ever used cases in your teaching in business?
Oh yeah, we use case studies all the time, Harvard case studies specifically because they do rotate those out a lot, which I like a lot. And we use standard APA case writing format and case analysis. But we've used it in a traditional way where an individual student might be working on it on their own, or we've actually had times where we've had debates in classes, verbal debates in classes. And also there's been times where if I'm teaching an online class, which I do quite frequently, I have students get into their own Zoom room and discuss the case and debate it back and forth as well. So that's a little bit hands-on as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I know you're going to have to go at 2:30. So before you do, was there anything, if you were able to take a look at the chapter, was there anything that particularly jumped out to you or stuck out to you from the reading?
Well, I did read the chapter, and what was interesting to me is I have been doing all of this for the last 15, 16 years. I've been teaching for 27 years, but I moved towards a more project-based instructor the last 15, 16 years. And so I felt like a lot of this was already happening with me organically, basically because it makes teaching really fun and different, and it changes things up. Because if I had to teach research methods the same way over and over again, I think I would lose my mind. So working with students on these projects such as that, those are just two examples. All of my classes have project-based learning in them. The technology acquisition projects change every year because it's different projects every year. So I think that it just reiterated to me that I'm doing things well and to keep doing it from reading that chapter.
So I'm really glad you had that takeaway. And it's interesting because it dovetails with the experience, in the chapter, there's some reflections from the authors who have also been teaching for a long time. And one of them was talking about how when they started teaching, they, weren't doing things quite as well and how they learned little by little from their mistakes and from their students how to kind of make it better and make the classroom be a more dynamic and equitable space for deep learning. And I was wondering, Cindy, just one last question for you is, you said mentioned 15, 16 years ago, you kind of shifted from a more maybe traditional teaching approach to a more project-based approach. And I wonder just what, prompted that shift and what made you realize, like, I think this is going to be better for, learning.
Well, I'm a true Southerner, so I love to talk. So I can lecture all day long, and I think I'm very dynamic at it as well. But after you hear yourself, some subject areas, they just stay the same. Some of the topics are tried and true, and they're just never going to change. So I kind of got tired of hearing myself and listening to myself. And then once that starts happening, and you know that you're not motivating your students in the classroom because you're not motivated as well, you need to change. So I started thinking about, I was like, what could I do differently in my classes? And I started thinking, I'm going to change everything, all of my classes to have at least one project-based learning assignment, or if the class fits, make it the entire semester and incorporate everything else into it that they need to learn along the way.
Nice. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. And one of my key takeaways from the chapter, which I put in the document, was just this idea of constructivism, which kind of weaves through the entire book. But it's just, can be summed up, or one way of summing it up is this notion that whoever's doing the work, doing the most active thing is doing the most learning. And if it's the professor who's up there being super dynamic and the students are just sitting quietly, it's likely the students will be doing more learning if they're being super dynamic and active and actually engaging with the material in a way that the projects that you're doing with your students now inherently does, just by the structure of the way the class is happening. So thank you so much for being our first special guest, and feel free to jump in at any point before you have to go if you want to share anything else. But for now, I'd love to turn it over to our next special guest, Liza Lynch. Liza, would you mind telling us a bit about your what you do here at Wentworth, also the question in the chat, a project that you either did as a student or as a professor, and then I'd love to, I mean, your students' work is absolutely incredible, so I'm sure we'd all be delighted to see some images of it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Liza. I teach for the industrial design department. I have been full-time almost 2 years, and before that, adjuncting and an assistant professor, or excuse me, visiting assistant professor. A project that really stuck out for me was my freshman year in undergrad, where it was a get to know you, but also sort of some open-ended thinking and problem solving. And that was, they had all of us, and everyone was mixed in foundations at that point still, go home and like sort of clean out our junk drawers a little bit in our dorm rooms, and then put all of that in an envelope. And then they put the envelopes in a box and you had to repick it. And then we got shuffled into groups. And our only task was to make the tallest structure we could out of everything we had in there, with no adhesives or anything like that. So it was super fun way to get to know everyone and get to use what we would normally call like junk materials, but now they were found materials. So that was super awesome. In terms of project-based learning, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, second here. So I felt like the chapter really resonated with me. We do project-based learning in industrial design, and emulating the professional practice is huge for us. So as you can see with this particular project at the top, we frame it as, this is what your client's saying, these are the outcomes we want, like this is what you're going to be using. And then we start with doing research to better understand that problem, which we'll look at in just a moment. Over on the side, those drawings are examples of past student works, just to give them a jumping off point, get the juices flowing, so to speak. So we start with research. So for this particular project, it's making an animated toy for Timo out of EVA foam and wood. So first the students need to do a bunch of research to understand the problem they need to solve. In this case, like how big a toddler is, what their skills are, what toddler toys look like. And we also had them for fun make these standees of themselves as toddlers. So their parents, emailed or sent them pictures of themselves, and then they blew them up to toddler size and mounted them on foam core, just to reiterate what kind of size we are making. And then just for a little added twist, we gave them a couple vehicles as jumping off points to think about curves, how they work, all that sort of thing. Trying to get them to think that animated means more than like wheels moving. So we start off with sketching. These were done on an iPad Pro. Students can either do paper or do this. So this student is exploring the different types of movement he could get out of the Jeep. So on the bottom left, we can see he's thinking about like the bumper, the headlights coming out as the Jeep structure moves forward. So I look at these, then we discuss it, talk about pros and cons, we make some decisions, and we move forward. So then we got into the model base. So he wanted something that was sort of like super chunky, basic geometric form, coming up from his research. Things we talked about with this particular piece was in between the windshield and the covering that you pull forward, you can't really get your hand in there, even the toddler. And then also thinking about how the toddler is going to hold that in their hand. Because even while the student Jay was talking to me about it, they were having a hard time holding it. And I was like, well, if this whole thing's made out of wood, isn't that going to be too heavy for them? And they won't be able to get their hand around it, that sort of thing. So we discussed and iterated again. And this was his next model. So the pistons. So we think about like those Jeeps and how they're sort of rugged and they move around like this. So we had a long discussion about that. So in this one, as the Jeep moves forward, the pistons move the hood of the sort of Jeep up and down, and he made the whole mechanism work really beautifully where the covering comes out, changing out the faces and, that little first aid kit, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll move into our next iteration. Currently, he's working on making the mechanics move. So the pistons work okay here, but he needs to do another iteration. And then we're also going to connect them a little bit better to the axle so we can get the same movement reiterated in the wheels. And then this is just another example of a student's work, Nora. So we're about halfway through the project right now. So you can actually physically pick up the cab and turn it of the little backhoe, and then you can match the tools to the color so they can change out a different set of tools. So I feel like a lot of things that we were reading about in this chapter, we were doing in terms of emulating the professional world, in terms of thinking about research, giving lots of feedback, and then they apply that to the next round and move forward. So I thought that was really great. And one thing that really resonated with me from the chapter was the GRASPS framework, the goal, role, audience, situation, product performance, and standards and success criteria. I just sort of never thought about framing the whole project in that way. And I thought it made it very digestible for the students and easy to understand. So that was really great.
Super. Thank you so much. Yeah. One thing I thought about when we were looking at your assignment was just the way that it mirrored some of the assignment examples in the chapter where it was, like not just, oh, design this random thing, but it was like you're imagine yourself in a role, like we're designing this for the History Channel producer because they need this type of script for the show they're pitching, So it's very specific and very real world and mimics something authentic. Another way that I thought that was really neat that they tie in this idea of tilt, of transparency and learning and teaching, and making those types of assignments be even more transparent so that all students have access to success more equitably. How did that resonate with you, that part about tilt, in terms of, how you design your assignments? Did it reinforce some things you're already doing, or were you like, oh, I have this idea, maybe I could include that in a future assignment?
I think a lot of the things, we were already doing, but we could probably hit like a little bit more specifically. Followed what I didn't put up there is we have a schedule from like day to day what we're doing in class and then what the homework is that's going to be the due the next day. And it's all like very clear, very straightforward. And, we're very clear about the objectives, but like maybe we could just sort of, going back to that goal structure, what I really like success means here, like an animated toy for a toddler. That's what we're really looking for. So I think that's one thing that could be incorporated.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Liza and Cindy, for being special guests and preparing all of this stuff. Afsaneh from engineering was also going to be a special guest. She is in the midst of a search right now and had randomly a bunch of meetings that she had to be in. So she said she was going to try and pop in for a few minutes, but if she can't, she sent me her slides and I can talk about them really briefly. Thanks, Cindy, because we've worked together on a bunch of engineering classes in the past. So I can do that if she's not able to come in the next little while. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear from some of the other folks on the call. I know, Susanna, you have used project-based learning in the sciences, and Carol, obviously, the studio method of teaching architecture is inherently project-based. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then obviously Misty and Carolyn, you have amazing thoughts about teaching and learning. I'd love to hear those and your experiences as well. And Marie Claire, I know you mentioned you're not able to get off the audio, whatever. So I hope you're enjoying listening. And next time we'd love to hear from you as well. So of the folks who are remaining who haven't shared anything yet, who would like to jump in now? The floor is open. Go for it.
I could jump in. Um, like you said, Josh, architecture education is inherently project-based, like Liza in industrial design. And I've been at Wentworth since 2009. I love it that Cindy Stevens keeps her years to the half year. So I've been here, I guess, for uh, all those years, 15 and a half years. And before I was arrived at Wentworth, I taught at a number of other schools, and one of my favorite studios that I ever taught was when I was teaching at Harvard Graduate School of Design. It's very it's favorite. Some I still stay in touch with some of the students from this studio, and I think it's because it was such a unique project. At the time, I had been invited by the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which is joint between the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and the Kennedy School, the KSG. And they had been invited to do research on a project for the national. It's called it has a particular name. We know them as like trailers. They're a house on a permanent chassis, and they're actually called manufactured housing. So the Joint Center for Housing Studies was hired to do a study on manufactured housing. And they asked me to be involved because I had what they call a physical background. And maybe kind of look behind myself, like, whoa, what kind of background do you guys have over there at the Kennedy School? But after I did this reportage, I got very interested in this house on the permanent chassis, and a lot of things came out of it, articles and a bunch of things. But one project-based studio that I taught that came to mind when you gave us the prompt, Josh, was a studio for grad students at the GSD, which was to design a house on a permanent chassis. But we began the research phase of it, by going out to a mobile home park on Route 1 north of Boston. And our task was to disassemble the entire mobile home and fit it into the small, correct size dumpster for that size of a mobile home. So the guy whose park it was knew if the dumpster was X dimension, a house of Y should fit in it. And he had people who he didn't trust to fit the big house into the correct small lower fee dumpster. And so that was his real charge for us. You Harvard folks can come around if you want, but you have to fit it in that little dumpster. Otherwise it costs me too much money. So it was a lesson in how the houses go together, but it was also this big challenge for three-dimensional thinking to be able to get all of those parts. And we did it in one afternoon. It was lightning tear apart the house.
Oh, that is a great story. And kind of reminds me of the one of the quotes from the very beginning of the chapter where the authors say, we'd go so far as to bet that academic knowledge you best remember from more than 10 years ago is still with you as a result of project work. And definitely, if I were a student in that class, I would remember going out to a mobile home park and having to disassemble a house and try and fit in a dumpster with a time constraint and, the budgetary, real world concern that this guy needs this to happen or else he's gonna have to pay more money. So that sounds extremely memorable. And yeah, tell us a bit about how you see project-based learning kind of bring architecture to life or bring architecture education to life in your studio here at Wentworth.
Um, the kind of thinking about project-based learning emerged in my experience since I've been at Wentworth. Architecture is just inherently project-based, and I remember at the time that the notion of design thinking came out of the Stanford Business School, and I thought, how did that happen? It should have come from architecture schools. We've been doing this all the way along. And I think it's the same with project-based learning, that somehow um, architecture has not done a great job generalizing knowledge about our techniques and fundamental approaches and sharing it outside the discipline. I think, like for instance, when Mark C. Thompson came to Wentworth, I asked him if he knew anything about design education, and he said not one thing. I've never even thought or heard about it before. So there's a gap in the literature between architecture and the rest of, the folks who are interested in project-based learning too, on the topic of, I don't know, studio education. There isn't great literature about studio education.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the ways in which potentially we could collaborate across disciplines and schools here at Wentworth, because obviously everyone in the School of Architecture and Design is already doing project-based learning. And, some folks in other disciplines, especially, I mean, the engineering design thinking process is the same thing. I mean, and so many schools are using this type of thing. And scientific method is basically the same thing. So there's a lot of ways in which there could be overlap and cross-pollination between schools and disciplines. Yeah, speaking of that, why don't we turn it over to Susanna and tell us a bit about your experiences using project-based learning in the science classroom, and you can also give us your perspective as an associate dean about how maybe these types of initiatives could come into at the school level as well.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, so my focus on project-based learning has been to use real-world cases. And what I added to the document is the link to the National Science Teachers Association Case Studies in Science collection. And I've used a bunch of those different ones in several different classes. The one example I'll give you, I teach biochemistry and gene or molecular biology, if that's helpful. And it's easy for me to talk about the different techniques or teach them, but also trying to help the students figure out where to apply them. So one of the cases that I use that I think students find really fun is it's based on an idea of a trial. Two seed companies, one seed company thinks the other stole their seeds, and they use molecular or biology tools to try and confirm that. And so the students have to learn the techniques. I have them teach it, talk about them, and then I randomly assign them to either one or the other of the seed companies or the judicial panel that manages the trial. In the second class, they go through a trial. So for me, I think it's a really good opportunity for them to see why learning some of the techniques is important and potentially useful. Expert witnesses are a real life thing. And so having that experience to argue for it. And in reality, there's some nuances to the case and some things like that there's not a clear right or wrong answer, which also I think links with the way the chapter is written. Messy is real life. And this is an example of that. And so and I don't do just one, I do multiple cases always. And some are, other kinds of things, but they are generally accessible in ways to apply the lecture kind of material into the real life. Because in sciences, when I first started doing cases 20 years ago or something, um, I don't think I was as aware of how limited the linkage was for some students. And so I feel that these are really helpful. And so besides sort of describing the cases and getting those are free, there are a bunch of teacher resources. So I've written some cases. So they don't just give you the case, they describe, what's the main point? How do you teach it? What are the backgrounds? They give you the answers if there are questions or things, how to interpret things. And so, and different ways to run the particular case. So I find the resources really, really helpful.
It's fantastic. Yeah, and I know that in management, there's a lot of similar kind of curriculum that exists and is free for everyone to access. Harvard Business Review has great ones that relate not only to management, but all sorts of topics, that come into all sorts of disciplines, kind of, cross into these stories and these real world examples. Something else I love about what you were saying is that in the course of adjudicating these case or whatever it might be, students are building all sorts of other skills in addition to those science skills. They're, cooperation, collaboration, argumentation, communication, etc. And those might align with some of the course learning objectives or even the school's learning objectives that it would, anyone who leaves Wentworth trained as an engineer or architect or designer has to not only have technical capacities, but also these skills that, as they talked about in the chapter, employers really value people who can come out and be able to communicate effectively or work effectively in teams. So how have you seen that happen in your classrooms? Students who maybe come in not having that type of experience. How have you been able to scaffold in that teaching so that they can get better at the skill of collaborating in a team or making an argument in front of a group or whatever it might be, and seen that develop alongside their scientific expertise?
Yeah, but before I forget, the other skill that comes up in many of the cases are ethics.
Hmm.
And that doesn't always come through in some of the regular science curriculum, but of course it's extremely important right now with all the applications of genes and gene technology in real life that people hear about. Um, I, what I've done I always do multiple cases. It is a frame of presentation or interaction that students aren't necessarily used to. And so if you do a one-off, I think students don't understand or see that linkage or get into it as much. And so I do usually 4 to 6 of these cases throughout the semester, and it's usually a nice break from the lecture. Sometimes I do them in the lecture, sometimes I do them in the lab. We also have, besides the lecture, we have labs where the students work. So it's a nice sort of shift and, learn about it, practice it kind of back and forth. And so that's an approach I think that works. And I usually keep them in the same groups so they get practice. And I think that was a bit in the chapter rather than throwing them into one group that they never, that they have no practice with, help them build the skills. And in a previous iteration, I didn't do it this past summer when I taught, but I would have the students give each other ratings. And I think the chapter makes that point, how to hold students accountable for group work. I think there's some many challenges with that, and I haven't found the best strategy for that to help motivate students, holding them accountable, I do try and ask them, to know all of in that particular example, all of those techniques, because we use them all at various stages, but maybe they only presented on one of them. Anyway.
Carol, hop on in.
Well, I wanted to say, it's so interesting to talk about the Harvard Business School case studies. I teach a course in professional practice that's underway this spring, and we begin and end with the subject of ethics, and use two of the case studies that are about architects. And we do a lot of projects at the senior level, and other levels in the school also, use with working with students on teams. And since arrived at Wentworth, I took a course at Simmons School of Management, and I took away from that a tool that I put to use every semester with students who are working in team-based projects, which is that they need to write their own norms and treat
Within
the
the team?
norms as a kind of living document. So
Mm-hmm.
how are they going to communicate what platforms, and how are they going to keep track of their decisions, and et cetera. So we open it up a bit. And if a group ever starts to complain that they're having some negative group dynamics, we ask them to share with us their living current document of their norms. And then at the end, we do an evaluation of, it's called a self and peer evaluation. So they get to evaluate themselves along with their teammates. And those two, they're sort of like brackets: start your norms and keep them going. And then at the end, look at the self-evaluation and look again at the norms and take some notes about how, what are the take-homes from this experience. When I was a student, group projects were universally detested, and people often got their worst grades in group projects, and then they did their worst work in group projects because they knew everything would sink to the level of the least motivated or accomplished person. And I'm very glad that has changed in my lifetime, because what in architecture, anything, I like books, I like buildings. Doing big, complicated projects, you have to work with teams. And so it's great to be able to teach that in school.
So can you provide those resources, Carol?
The like norms or
Whatever the document that you sound
Yeah,
like you have.
I'd be glad to. I'm so sorry I didn't get to read the book and be part of this conversation. But like Josh says, I just happened to email him um, within the last hour and a half. So that's why I'm here. But I'll definitely be um, glad to share some things for sure.
Thank you.
For more context, you emailed me with a proposal to present at the showcase about a project-based learning course that you're teaching, basically. So I was like, this is perfect for you. Um, so so well, I know that we are running a little short on time. I definitely want to make sure Misty and Carolyn have a chance to share their thoughts, introduce themselves. So why don't you all take it away? Feel free to answer for like opening prompt question if you want to, about a memorable project experience you had, and then other thoughts about the chapter or the topic.
I wanted to share a project that my son did in his high school because it was really memorable for me. I learned a lot from it. I'm just going to share what he did. So this is an ongoing project at Boston Latin School where it was this shared green roof where they made. So this project wasn't attached to a particular course. It's interdisciplinary, and the project really had the students really think in lots of different ways. So they were thinking about sustainability. They're thinking about the physics of building a shared roof. They're doing systems thinking. So how does this green roof project, how can we make greater change throughout the community, whether it's climate, whether it's food necessities and all these things. And it was kind of an ongoing project. I think he joined the group, and I can put the link for you I think maybe his freshman year, and then he was part of this. So it was an ongoing project that he every year would bring some new kind of learning to it. And the students were able to take this project from, different iterations, whether it was figuring out how do we create a sprinkler system, the physics of that and the mechanics of that, to how do we harvest this food in a way that is going to make it portable and usable, and that storage. And then what do we do with the winter? How do we prepare these gardens? So it was, any student could join, but they required students to use their learning from other classes. How do we engage with the community through our speaking skills as we present our ideas? And it was just this amazing ongoing project that really required students to use all different kinds of learning and skills, and they could do a capstone project at the very end of it. But it was, to me, one of the more, a real life project, and it was really this incredibly compelling learning experience. I'll put a link to their project there, where I ended up learning as a parent, going and visiting and being like, wow, these are 15-year-olds who are really doing amazing work because they're excited about the hands-on aspect and seeing something come to fruition in real life. So that was one of the more exciting project-based learning things that I've seen happen.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's fascinating. And I keep on hearing this theme of interdisciplinary collaboration, and it just seems that projects inherently draw from that because, as Susanna said, the real world is messy. The real world does involve all these different voices and needs that have to be brought in. So I think that's wonderful, and maybe something to consider at Wentworth as we try and move from more siloed experience to an educational experience that's more holistic and mirrors a real world in which architects and engineers and project managers and construction managers and marketers are all working together on a larger scale project. So Carolyn, do you want to take it away? Tell us about you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Also, hi everyone. I'm Carolyn, and I'm a new instructional designer at TLC. And actually, the first thing that popped into my mind, although I've had a lot of experience teaching, working with teachers, developing curriculum, and even researching project-based education, the first thing that popped into my mind was a graduate course that I took, and it was like 2 days into the course, and I was very unfamiliar with the content. And they're like, okay, now choose a research question and you're going to do this project. And I was like, wait. No, like the research question, do your own project is like the final thing, right? Like you don't just do that on day two. Like I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I just thought, by that point I had, enough experience in project-based education that I had kind of become rote in the way I was thinking about it. And so it was kind of felt good to get pushed a little bit out of my comfort zone as a student. And I did enjoy that project. I definitely spent a little bit of time being like, wait, what? I don't even know what's going on. Why do I need to, choose a subject and choose a research question? So that was the first thing that I thought of in terms of my own example. But in terms of the chapter, what really fascinates me, I think, is the social dynamics of doing projects together. There was this link in the chapter to the Gracious Space Project, which I thought was really interesting. It's from the Center on Ethical Leadership. And just their work really focuses on learning in public and what it takes to build a classroom culture where people are free to kind of learn in public, and even instructors are free to learn in public with other instructors as they do project-based education. So I really appreciated the attention to that in the chapter, because I think the first thing you think about when doing project-based education very often is, how am I going to put this puzzle together? And not as much about, how am I going to create a classroom environment that's going to be really conducive to doing this kind of work? So yeah, I like that.
Fabulous. Thanks so much for sharing that. And something that your graduate school example made me think of from the chapters when they talked about transparency and learning and teaching. And they were like, if you're going to give students a project that's intentionally like throwing them a curveball because you want them to think in a different way, let them in on the secret. I'm giving you this, and of course it's going to feel confusing and a lot on day two, but here's the reason, part of it is that, in the real world, you might be faced with this situation or whatever that might be. So I'll kind of tie that into a little bit of the engineering context that Afsaneh was gonna share. So this is her first slide, and she likes to focus on kind of inquiry-based learning in especially her engineering design thinking classes, which are kind of at the beginning, towards the beginning of a Wentworth engineer's journey, where they're really learning how to think like an engineer rather than just do a specific technical thing. So she talks about being inquisitive is what engineers do, being inquisitive about how something works, why it works that way, what if it worked a different way? Is this the most efficient way? How else could it function? Remembering that the what, the content, what it is, and the how, kind of like the form and the content equals the results that we're going for, and consider experimentation as a continual iterative process. And she and I worked on a proposal that we presented at the American Society for Engineering Education about engineering design thinking that was all about that engineering design as an iterative process and bringing in some of the work from it's funny that Carol mentioned the Stanford School of Business and Design Thinking, because we actually collaborated with a gentleman from Dartmouth's School of Engineering who also has a background in management and brought in a lot of that stuff from design thinking and from Stanford and kind of adapted it for the engineering context. So I thought that was really, really cool. And it was really exciting to go into those classrooms at Wentworth and see the students really doing a lot of hands-on work. At first, building with Legos, simple stuff, and then little by little, and Afsaneh works with electrical engineering, so you can see they're working on circuit boards over here and figuring out, how's this going to work? And this is an electrocardiogram, which is kind of an advanced circuit board for specific medical function. Something that we talked about as well with engineering is that a more traditional model of like beginning engineering was kind of designing to specs, or in other words, students had to design something kind of within a very narrow framework, which gave them the opportunity to learn the materials and everything, which was great. But it was just it trains with such a narrow mind frame of like, this is how it has to be done, following step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you get this result, which is a result that somebody came up with through experimentation, design, iteration, and figuring out little by little what the best way is. So her perspective, and I think one that's gaining more traction in the engineering education community, is to give a little bit more room for the inquiry-based projects where the students get a chance to really use the design process to figure out what's going to be the most efficient way and try different ways and connect it this way and connect it that way and come up with their own processes. And then, of course, get to learn, what the standard operating procedure is. And then once they do, then they have a deeper understanding of why that might be the case, because of these, different constraints they've experimented with. But also, ideally, we're training engineers who will always have the lookout for what's the better process, what's a new way to be able to do something, rather than just training folks who can, follow the standard manual. So I think that's really neat, because I think it ties back to what Carol, you were saying about how, in your lifetime, you've seen these types of project-based learning things be onerous, and the culture around it is kind of toxic, to like, actually, no, this is the best way to learn. This is the most authentic way to learn. It's the most rich and vibrant way to learn. And we see that maybe in engineering as well, with, the world changing so quickly. Oh my gosh, with machine learning, AI, all this stuff, the training that we get in school should really prepare us for a constantly changing world and having the capacities to adapt to that, rather than just meeting the world where it is right now and knowing how to do the things with the tools that exist now, because they're going to constantly change and develop. With our last few minutes, any concluding thoughts from folks about what we've talked about anything from the chapter, or just any other thoughts about project-based learning and all of its variants out there in the world?
Be curious, how do we test students' learning in a project base, and what are and this, we don't have time maybe to go into it, but there are different strategies for testing that, especially if it's a group project and you want to make sure all the students have an understanding of the whole project, as opposed to just maybe the piece or pieces that they did.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that you brought in this question of assessment. I think in the chapter they do bring in the notion of instructional alignment, making sure that you're learning objectives and what it is that the students are going to do are very clearly aligned, and that as a result of doing the project, you will be able to see not only in the resulting stage, but throughout the process how students are getting towards that learning objective and to what extent they're able to meet it. But does anyone else have any other thoughts about the assessment of projects and what you might do in your classrooms?
Um, Again, coming out of the design studio, the big event at the end of the semester is called a final review, and the students stand up and present their work. And when it's a team-based project, they present it as a team. And also, we have rubrics for each review over the course of the semester and give feedback in the rubric format. And I was talking before about the peer and self-evaluations. They submit those after each significant review. It's not just at the end of the whole project. It's like the mid-project review we're having in my thesis studio on tomorrow. And so I have a rubric and I'll pass that back to students. The thesis students are working solo on projects, but still on projects.
I just want to tie that back into something in the chapter. When you talk about tilt, they talk about one possibility of showing examples of work, both work that's exemplars, but also work that might not be as good, and having students critique those and maybe actually building rubrics for what excellent work looks like from that critique process, so that when students are the ones who come up with the criteria, then they really own it. Even more so than if they're just handed it, although it's fine also to hand students a rubric, but just another possibility for what could happen in the classroom when assessing projects. As we wrap up, any other thoughts from folks about what we talked about today, or anything else you'd like to share? Well, it's been a real pleasure to talk with all of you this afternoon about project-based learning. Thank you so much for joining us, for bringing your experience and expertise to our special guests, for preparing in advance, and to everyone. I hope you'll be able to join us for future meetings of our Guilt-Free Book Club. We have 2 more sessions coming up about this book. And in the last one, Suzanne is going to co-host, and we are going to meet one of the authors, who's a fascinating person. And next time, we're going to focus on some strategies for equitable teaching, and that along with a bunch of faculty ambassadors of inclusive excellence. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. I know, Liza, you were an ambassador last year, so maybe you'll come back. That'd be really fun to have you. Once again, thanks, everyone. Anything else anyone wants to share before we wrap? Thanks so much. We'll see you hopefully soon.
Thanks,
Bye now.
Josh.
Bye.